Good morning, everybody. So, as I said in the lesson on Friday, I'll just need to finish off this topic. So this is the second lesson about the social structure of Imperial Germany. You're looking at the very first slide, the homepage there. So I'll need to sort of move through to where we reached on Friday's lesson. So just bear with me. So we started off looking at the old order and then the new order, how industrialisation created different social classes. We then looked at the aristocracy. And that's just to remind you, that's an important slide, how within the German Imperial Parliament, the landed nobility were represented by the Conservative Party and the new elites were represented by the National Liberals. And again, that's another important slide, that sort of concept of what we call Samlingspolitique. Okay, a very distinctive feature because industrialisation came late to Germany. The fear of socialism, which was the sort of feeling amongst these rapidly growing cities, the lower classes, turned to the ideas of Karl Marx, and were pushing for political change that would give the lower classes a say in the running of the country. And as a result of that, the two elites, the industrial elites being the new elites, and the old elites, the landed nobility, rather than compete against each other, which historically is what tended to happen in other countries where industrialisation was more gradual, in Germany, they basically partnered up. It's often called the Alliance of Steel and Rye, or Samlingspolitique, policy of concentration, working together to protect each other's interests against all the social classes below them that might be pushing for more power themselves. And we then looked at the white-collar workers, so a new middle class, office workers, professionals, educated types that sort of grew up in these industrial cities. So we looked at the type of professions, etc., of occupations. And again, what was happening there was a sort of hunger amongst these groups as to why is the power lying with those elites above us, pushing for greater representation themselves. And the white-collar workers were represented in Parliament by the left liberals. Okay, so we're now starting to talk about the political parties in the national parliament. Okay, so the left liberals tended to represent the white-collar workers, and the national liberals represented the industrial elites, and the Conservative Party represented the landed nobility. And as shown in that diagram, the Conservatives and the National Liberals tended to team up together when they voted in Parliament. The lower classes were represented by the SPD, the Social Democrats. That's the party of Marxism, okay? The ideas of Karl Marx, the Socialist Party, the party that was pushing to give power to the ordinary workers at the bottom of the pyramid. So we'll do a lot more about the political parties. And we finished off last lesson by basically saying there's one group that actually had little representation in the Reichstag, okay? And they tended to sort of take their fight outside Parliament through what we call pressure groups on the street. And ultimately, and this was the final point in Friday's lesson, looking ahead, and we are jumping ahead here, to in the first few years after World War One, actually they found a political party to represent their interests, and that was they were called the Nazi Party, formed after World War One. That's jumping ahead, okay, but just be mindful of that. So what we need to do now then, we've got about 10 more slides to sort of finish off, is we're going to be looking at the artisan class, the Mittelstand as they're called, okay. So now finish off the mind mapping as we go through this. Okay, so just pull back, let's look at it in a nutshell. So artisans, also known as Mittelstand, who are they? Okay, well they are a lower middle class, but they are still middle class. Okay, so they're higher status than the working classes. Remember, the working classes would be people who would rent accommodation rather than own accommodation, for example. Okay, middle classes tend to own their own houses. That's one way of looking at it. The working classes are generally relatively uneducated, whereas the middle classes would have a degree of education and may have professional qualifications. Okay, but the middle classes tend to sort of encourage a wide range of wealth. So at the top end of the middle class, you've got the big industrialists, you've also got the white collar workers, and then you've got the lower middle class. Now the lower middle class, they may not be particularly wealthy, but they have worked hard to get what they've got. They've got a bit of status. Okay, so for example, in a village, it may be a blacksmith or a wheelwright. Okay, they may employ one or two apprentices, but nevertheless they do employ people. They do own a little business. It could be a small shop, okay, a grocery store. That is better, it's higher status than being working class. Okay, you do have your own business. So that's what we mean by sort of the Mittelstand. They're a lower middle class, mainly small businessmen, possibly craft workers. Craft worker is like a small factory, but in a countryside. So it wouldn't be factory power, it wouldn't be coal power. It may just be sort of like hand power, basically, making things in a small workshop, those sorts of trades. Okay, so this group, and you need to use the word Mittelstand, okay, a lower middle class, more than any other social group, was massively under threat by the Industrial Revolution that swept through Europe in the 19th century and that arrived very late in Germany in the 1870s. And because the Industrial Revolution arrived very late, the threat to the middle class, the lower middle classes, the threat to the Mittelstand was very frightening to them. So I suppose that's something to sort of like park to one side. But remember that point, the Mittelstand were deeply afraid by the modern age, by the age of Industrial Revolution. Okay, so that's an important sort of concept. So that class, more than any other, was under threat from industrialisation, because what industrialisation did is it threatened to put them out of business. So as a result, the Mittelstand as a social class were often deeply conservative. Now remember, that word conservative with a small c means that they don't really like change. So in this sense, the change that they didn't like is industrialisation. Okay, before the Industrial Revolution arrived, when production was mainly in the countryside, small villages, etc., when there were not towns and cities, society was safer and more secure. So this social class felt very comfortable with the way society had been organised for hundreds of years, and now this sudden on-sweeping of industrialisation is very threatening to them. So the Mittelstand, therefore, had a sort of yearning, a sort of idealisation for a much simpler pre-industrial age. Okay, it used to be better before the Industrial Revolution. Life was better. Life was more simple before the Industrial Revolution. We preferred it before the Industrial Age. Okay, so the type of phrase we're talking about is they were anti-modernisation. They were against modernisation. Now, these are all important ideas because when we start talking about the Nazi Party, who are going to be a massively important group for this course, in a sense, Nazi ideology stemmed from this feeling. Okay, at the heart of Nazi ideology was this sort of like resentment of the modern age, and we'll do more about that. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. Let's just go on to the separate slides and the key points. Okay, I mean, I've just selected an image there. You know, in that particular case, that's a Mittelstand. He owns his own small shop. Okay, shopkeeper, small shopkeeper. Would be a typical Mittelstand. So they were the lower middle class. Artisans. An artisan is a craft worker or small scale traders. In other words, small shopkeepers or etc. Okay, so there we are. Small, often family owned businesses. Very deep rooted, very proud of their skilled labour. And the fact that what they make is handcrafted. So, you know, it may be they may make things in a small workshop, okay, which should just be a cottage or a small workshop basically, as opposed to a factory. These new factories that appeared in the industrial cities would mass produce goods, and the Mittelstand would say, well, that's not the quality. We produce quality because we make things by hand, okay. And whatever they made, so blacksmiths would make horseshoes, wheelwrights would make wheels, etc., etc. They were organised into what we call guilds. And the guild of blacksmiths or wheelwrights, I could give many other examples, were kind of organisations that protected the quality of their goods. Okay, they would regulate the price that they were sold on the market to ensure that there's fair competition. And the guilds had been around for hundreds of years, okay, ensuring that there were fair rules about the production of whatever they made, okay. But as I say, the problem was that much of what they did was based in villages and in the countryside. And then from the 1870s onwards, these new big cities and industrial cities were forming, and factories were making the same type of goods that they had been making in the countryside for hundreds of years. And the factories were mass producing much more cheaply the same type of goods, and they simply couldn't compete against that. Okay, so a powerful symbol of historical continuity. Continuity is a lovely word. It's sort of like it means lack of change. Okay. The guilds had organised small workshop production, high quality production for hundreds of years. Okay, and during this time of massive change, industrialisation, the guilds and the Mittelstand represented a simple pre-industrial age when they believed life was better. Okay, so they were very sort of anti the industrial age. They felt threatened by it. Okay, so now here's an important concept that make sure you get your mind around this. Okay, so when we say they were under threat, what exactly did that mean? Okay, so we talk about they were threatened from above and from below, and that's represented by these arrows here. Okay, so think of our social pyramid. Okay, so the first example I've just explained to you is really from above. But again, I'll just use an example, okay? A wheelwright makes wheels, okay? So in the countryside, the Mittelstand for hundreds of years may have had a small workshop in a village that makes wheels, and it would be handmade, okay? The owner of the business with maybe 2 or 3 apprenticeships, that would be their business, okay? And then suddenly, because of the Industrial Revolution, down the road, a city starts to grow up, an industrial town or city, and they have factories. And factories are harnessing a new type of energy based on coal. And the factories, these factories can mass produce goods. Okay, so there may be a factory that makes wheels, and because they can mass produce with big machines powered by coal and steam, because it's mass production methods, they can produce the wheels much more cheaply than the wheel produced in a small workshop in a village. And so what that basically means is the big businesses in the cities that have come out of the Industrial Revolution are going to corner the market. People will want to buy their wheels because their wheels will be cheaper because they're mass produced. And so basically the small businessman whose family business protected by his guilds in the countryside simply can't compete. His wheels are more expensive and nobody wants to buy them anymore. So his business the small businessman will be squeezed out by the big businesses, by the factories. So that's what we mean by that, okay? So they're under pressure from above, from the groups above, from the industrial new elites. These big factories are squeezing them out from above, okay? So they're under pressure there. So that's that sort of first point. From above, mechanised factories produce cheaper goods, impacting on artisan handmade businesses. For example, dyes, weaving. I gave the example of wheel production. Dyes and weaving would be another very good example. Okay, the manufacture of clothes. For hundreds of years in the countryside, textiles have been hand produced, quality on hand spinning wheels and in cottage industry. But these new big factories are going to mass produce clothes now, and simply it's going to squeeze out the artisans whose business is clothes production. Okay, so there's an example there from 1882 to 1895. One-man artisan businesses, their trade declined by 13.5%. Okay, but they're also being squeezed from below. Now, what does that mean? These new social classes at the bottom, okay, so the old labouring classes were peasants toiling in the fields, and of course now what's happening is many of the peasants are moving into the cities and they're taking on jobs in the factories, but they're very poor jobs, okay, they're paid a poor wage. The factory owner will give them cheap accommodation, which they will have to pay rent for. It'll be crowded, it'll be squalid, poor living conditions, and their wages and working conditions in the factories will be very, very poor, because ultimately the factory owners, their business is to make money, and they make money by ultimately paying the workers cheaply, paying them low wages, and they may not look after them properly. There may be dangerous working conditions, etc., etc. Okay, and this happened in every single country that industrialised. And so, with the passage of time, these new labouring classes in the urban areas, in other words, in the cities, become resentful. They start to talk to each other. And it's easier to talk to each other in the cities because you're closer together. When they were peasants in the countryside, you're on the fields all day, spread out, and you may go hours, days without really having an opportunity to talk to anyone. But the cities are crowded, so they're constantly talking. And also another factor in the cities is they have to have a basic rudimentary education. They've got to be able to read and write in order to understand the instruction manuals, how to work these machines, how to understand the safety rules for the factories, etc. And because they can read and write, they start to read literature, political literature, pamphlets, and that's where they start to come across the writings of men like Karl Marx, who would say, you shouldn't put up with this, okay? This is unacceptable. And once they start getting that message, then they become what we call unionised. So the working classes will start to realise collectively, if we pull together, we can actually put pressure on the bosses, the factory owners, the people running our business, to bring about change for us. And that's what we call a trades union. Trades union was simply groups of men in the factories who would form a union, and the union would say, we are not prepared to work, we will stop working. We call it a strike. We will stop working unless you pay us more, guarantee that our working conditions will be better, perhaps shorten our working hours, etc., etc. Okay, so trades unions were organisations of working class men who were pushing for reform in the workplace. Okay, and the process have just happened sort of like, it didn't happen overnight, it happened over decades and decades, bit by bit, gradually winning more rights. And with each of those victories, each time they persuaded and were able to get agreement from their boss, the factory owner, to give them a bit more, so for example, shorten the working hours, for example, pay them a bit more, of course it eats into the profits of the business, okay, because it costs the owner money to do that. It costs the owner money to pay his workers more. If they're going to have shortened working hours, then there's going to be less goods produced. So it comes at a cost for the business, okay? So that's what was happening in the cities. But of course, going back to the countryside, our artisans are also businessmen, okay? So it may be a very different type of business. It may be a small workshop in which he employs just 2 or 3 workers. But once unions start forming, those 2 or 3 workers working for the artisan in the countryside, those 2 or 3 workers working for him, if they belong to a union, they will also say, well, we want to be paid more as well. And it's all very well and good, the big factory owner in the city who's making huge profits, he can afford to pay his workers a little bit more. Whereas the artisan, the craft worker, who owns the small business in the countryside, the workshop or whatever, if his 2 or 3 workers are saying, well, we're not going to work for you unless you pay us a bit more because we belong to a union, well, that demand could be enough to put the business out of business, okay, because his profit margin is much less. So that's another pressure on the small businessman. Okay, big businesses are able to weather the cost of the unions more, whereas the small businessman would struggle with that. So that's what we mean by the artisans. They're literally being squeezed from 2 directions, from the pressures of big business at the top and from the pressures of unions at the bottom. So there's the point there. Here, also threatened from below by the rise of a unionised working class pushing for improved wages and working conditions which they could not afford to provide, which the artisans cannot afford to provide. So the point there is that if you're being squeezed in 2 directions, and both of those pressures, big business and unions, are a new feature arising out of the industrial age. So the industrial age is basically literally threatening to squeeze that social class out of existence. Okay, literally that pressure. Okay, they could see that in 10, 20, 30 years' time, we may not even exist anymore. Okay, and so when you've got that extreme fear that you're going to be pushed out of existence, then you will be looking for extreme solutions to your problems. And again, jumping ahead, we wonder why the artisans as a group, they did find an extreme solution, and that was the political party called the Nazi Party, okay, who promised to provide a solution to their problems. Okay, but again, that's jumping ahead. We'll get to that sometime after Christmas when we start to move into that depth study. Okay, but it's just sort of giving you a preview of that. Although reduced, the artisans proved very resilient, and we know that they didn't disappear because we know that they did find that solution, which was the Nazi Party in the 1920s and 1930s. Okay, so they proved very resilient. Resilient means sort of they clung on that and they survived and they fought back, and they were a very angry sector of society because they were driven by fear of modernisation, fear that an accelerating industrialisation would squeeze them out of existence. So they embraced radical political parties. Now, radical means extreme, okay? Political parties that would come up with extreme solutions, and that would harness and grab hold of their energy and their anger for their own purposes. And the Nazi Party proved to be the party that would eventually do that. So a little bit by Abrams about the Mittelstand, and there it says at the bottom, its members found themselves squeezed between big capital, in other words, big business, and the industrial proletariat. Proletariat is the word that Karl Marx uses to describe the working classes in the cities. Okay, unable to compete with one, but always in danger of falling into the latter. Okay, in other words, in danger of falling back to being working class, because if you're an artisan and you've worked hard to get your own business, and if basically you can't compete and you're squeezed out of existence, what do you become? You become working class again. Okay, and it's that fear of losing their status. They have worked hard to get a little bit of status. They may not be very wealthy, but they've got that status. I'm a self-made person, okay? And if my business goes under, I'm back being working class again. So there's one more social class in the pyramid, and that's the working class, okay? But we won't do that today. We need a whole lesson just on the working class, the very bottom part of the pyramid, so we'll get to that. Okay, so there are strands. We've covered the different social groups, and we've only conclusion then. So in a nutshell, just to conclude, industrialisation transformed German society. It resulted in many of the middle and lower classes pushing for upward social mobility and more political power for themselves. However, the Samlingspolitique, okay, the policy of concentration, the coming together of the old and new elites in Germany, basically meant that it was very difficult for the groups below the elites to actually get into that political and economic power. That whether you were a white-collar worker, or whether you were an artisan, or whether you were a worker in the cities or the countryside, getting access to the top level of society and the power that was there was blocked. So the years in the build-up towards World War I in 1914, we see increasing frustration, tensions and divisions, resentment, caused by the fact that the elites, the new and old elites, were rallying together and protecting their own interests, protecting their power. And beneath them, you've got all these other social groups with growing resentment. Okay, the fact that power was concentrated in the hands of a very small number of men, the old and new elites. Okay, so this diagram sort of kind of hopefully captures that fracturing of society. Okay, so at the top you've got the old classes, so you've got the old elites and the new elites, and they've aligned, they're working together for mutual protection, and they hold the power in Germany. Okay, so the old elites hold the political power, they control government. The new elites control the wealth. But that's a relatively small number of men holding an enormous amount of power. And then you've got the middle classes, okay, the white-collar workers and the artisans, and quite a resentful, okay, very interesting group of the middle classes, because what they want is they want upward social mobility, but it's blocked. That's why I've drawn that sort of heavy line there. Getting access, crossing that line to the top, is very difficult because the elites are sort of like rallying together to protect their interests. But you've also not got, as well as resentment against the fact that they can't rise up, you've also got fear. Okay, these new groups are very fearful because at the bottom of society, you've got the working class, and the working class are rapidly growing. These are the factory workers. Karl Marx called them the proletariat, and they're growing stronger and stronger. I'll give you an example. They're forming trade unions. Okay, so they've got strength in numbers, these groups, and we'll do a whole lesson on these groups. And they're becoming organised, so they're starting to organise themselves into trades unions, but they're also starting to read political literature, the writings, for example, of Karl Marx, that are saying you could do more than that. It's not just about forming trades unions and persuading the bosses to give you more money. Why don't you rise up and overthrow them? Why don't you just seize their wealth? So these lower groups are potentially turning revolutionary. But that's going to create fear. It creates fear amongst the middle classes, because if the lower classes rise up against them, these white-collar workers and the artisans will lose everything. But it also creates fear at the top level. Okay, so you've got a very, very sort of divided and fearful, fractured sort of society. And those are the points that we've reached in the conclusion. So let's have a look at what it says. In spite of the industrial takeoff, there was very little social mobility. What movement there was tended to be within a class rather than between the different classes. And there was very little change at the top level of society, in which the junker elites jealously guarded their old privileges. And I say the new middle classes likewise sort of like protected their power, their wealth, by pairing up with the junker elites. So uniquely to Germany, the upper middle levels of society, especially the new industrialists, chose to align themselves alongside the traditional upper classes rather than compete against them. You have political power, we have economic power type mentality. We've already said that. But in spite of this, there was growing pressure for political change from the lower levels of the social pyramid, especially the Mittelstand and the industrial working class. Okay, so there's our finished in a nutshell, and obviously hopefully your mind map has got a lot more detail in, but that single page hopefully just captures the key points for you. Now it says flip learning for next lesson. Actually, next lesson, Wednesday's lesson, remember we're going to do a whole lesson about what an A-level essay looks like. So that's sort of we'll give a little bit of respite. So the next lesson but one, what we'll do is we'll look at the industrial takeoff. We need to talk more about the Industrial Revolution. So for that lesson, which will be just over a week, from the textbook, read pages 39 to 41 up to 1914, and also my class notes on this topic, which I'll give to you in advance of that lesson. And think especially about those three factors: the extent of change, the immediate reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened in Germany, and the long-term reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened in Germany. Okay, so there we go. Lesson finished. Hopefully that was useful for you, and I'll see you, I think, on Wednesday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.